When is the right time to fire a head coach in the NFL? That is the biggest question I am going to try to answer in this video. To answer this question, we are going to try to answer 5 other questions. How long do we need to see before we know how good or bad a coach is? How long does it take to turn a program around? What are the odds that an organization can do better? How did coaches that got multiple chances to be a head coach do? And are coaches good because they're long tenured, or are coaches long tenured because they're good? To answer these questions, I went back and tracked every coach whose last season coaching with a particular team was in the year 2000. So if a head coach coached a team in 1998 but his last season with that team was in 2002, I included him in my charts. Or if the head coach's first year was in 1997 and his last year was in 2000, I also included a coach like that in my charts. But now with all of that out of the way, let's tackle these questions. Of course, we're going to start with the first 2 questions because they're very much related. To start this off, we're going to talk about what the first season for a head coach tells us. Now, please keep in mind that not every first season on here is a full season because some of these coaches started off as interim coaches. I only counted a coach's first season as his first season if he coached a minimum of 8 games in his first season. For some of these coaches, I didn't count their first season until the following season where they actually coached the full season. So I have 147 coaches on here, excluding 1-year coaches or coaches that only coached for 1 season. Of these 147 coaches, 55 of them started their tenure with a winning record. Of those 55 coaches that started their tenure with a winning record, 38 of them went on to have a winning record during their stint. 16 of them went on to have a losing record during their stint, and 1 of them went on to have a 500 record during their stint with a particular team. And now 76 of these 147 coaches starting their tenure with a losing record. Of those 76 coaches, 16 of them went on to have a winning record during their stay with a team. 59 of them went on to have a losing record during their stay with a team. And 1 of them went on to have a 500 record during their stint with a particular team. And then 16 of these 147 coaches started their tenure with an exactly 500 record. 8 of those coaches went on to have a winning record during their stint, and 8 of them went on to have a losing record during their stint. So surprisingly, the first season is kind of telling, if you ask me. If you start off good, you're probably going to end good. If you start bad, you're probably going to end bad. And then if you start 500, it could go either way. It's certainly an interesting coincidence that 50% of the coaches that started with a 500 record went on to have a winning tenure, and 50% of the coaches that started with a 500 record went on to have a losing tenure. This graph represents the 147 coaches I was talking about on the prior slide. Now, when I re-looked at the graph, it turned out that about 3 to 5 of the coaches are missing. How this happened, I don't know, but I think it's still accurate enough to tell a story. On the horizontal line is what the coaches' win percentages were in their first season, and on the vertical line is a coach's ending winning percentage with a team. I tried to accent the 50% line on both of these axes. So it's not in a straight line, and it's not a perfect correlation, but starting good is definitely better than starting bad. Look past the 50% line on the vertical axis. There's definitely some coaches that are in the lower quadrant, but most of those coaches are in the upper quadrant. And on the flip side, it's almost overwhelming how starting with a losing record probably means ending with an overall losing record. Based on looking at this graph, you probably don't want your coach to start any worse than 7-9. Just strictly looking at this graph, it appears that starting 7-9 is probably your cutoff in terms of how good or bad the win percentage is going to be in the end. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is inheritance. What was the record of the team that a particular coach inherited? And how much of a role does inheritance play in how the coach will be in the short term? And as we get further into the video, the long term as well. On the horizontal line is what the record of the team was the year before a head coach took over, and on the vertical line is what the record was in a coach's first season. If a coach inherited an expansion team, I put them on the 0% line. I should also note that some data points are covered up because of similar results. But looking at this graph, there's surprisingly not very much correlation between inheriting a good or a bad team and having a winning or losing record. Don't get me wrong, it definitely helps to inherit a winning team. When you go to the right side of the graph, more of the data points are in the upper right quadrant than they are in the lower right quadrant. But when you go over to the left side of the graph, most of the data points are indeed in the lower quadrant, but there are definitely more data points in the upper quadrant on the left side of the graph than you might think. So at least based on looking at this particular graph, obviously correlation doesn't always equal causation, but inheritance is really not that large of a factor in how a coach will perform. Alright, so I talked about what the first season tells us, but what does the first 2 seasons of a head coach's tenure tell us? Again, just like with coaches that coached for 1 season, I excluded 2-year coaches. And also, I only counted a coach's first season if he coached a minimum of 8 games in his first season. So of these 114 coaches that coached more than 2 years, 49 of them had a winning record during their first 2 seasons. Of those 49 coaches, 40 of them went on to have a winning record during their stint, and 9 of them went on to have a losing record during their stint. And then 11 of the 114 coaches started with a 500 record. Of those 11 coaches that started with an exactly 500 record, 7 of them went on to have a winning record during their stints with the team, 3 of them went on to have a losing record, and 1 of them went on to have an exactly 500 record. And then of those 114 coaches, 54 of them had an overall losing record after 2 years. Of those 54 coaches that had a losing record after 2 years, 9 of them went on to have a winning record during their stint, and 45 of them went on to have a losing record during their stint. If we thought the first season was telling, the second season is extremely telling. I would almost argue that you probably have a pretty good idea of how a coach is going to be after 2 years, just at least looking at this data. Here's the graph that shows the data from the prior slide. And again, some data points are covered up due to similar results, and even some data points are missing for some reason that I don't know. But again, I think it's more than accurate enough to tell a story. If we thought the first season was telling of what a coach's record will be, the first 2 seasons are extremely telling. These data points, again, aren't in perfect correlation, but the correlation on this graph is pretty strong in my opinion. If you go and look at the right side of the graph, an overwhelming amount of coaches that started above 500 are in the upper right quadrant. And if you go to the lower side of the graph, there are very few data points in the lower right quadrant, because starting good in your first 2 seasons way more often than not means having an overall winning record during your stints with a team. And then again, if you go to the left side of the graph, an overwhelming amount of data points are in the lower left quadrant. So if you have a losing record after 2 years, you're probably going to have a losing record overall. Like, look how few of data points are in the upper left quadrant. And even of those data points in the upper left quadrant, those coaches were barely below 500. Most of those coaches in their first 2 seasons started between 40 and 50%. So I guess when we look at this particular graph, the cutoff for the first 2 seasons appears to be about 40%. If your coach doesn't win at least 40% of his games in his first 2 seasons, he's probably not going to turn it around. So here's the inheritance graph, just like I did with what does the first season tell us. And again, inheritance, it does play a role, but it doesn't play as big of a role as you might think it plays. If you go over to the right side of the graph, a higher portion of the coaches that inherited a winning team are in the upper right quadrant. But there are still coaches in the lower right quadrant. So again, inheriting a winning team definitely helps, but it's not the deciding factor in how good a coach will be. And then when you go over to the left side of the graph, a higher portion of the coaches that inherited a losing team did end up having a losing record after 2 years, but the disparity between the upper left quadrant and the lower left quadrant, at least in my opinion, is not as big as you would think it would be. I guess one thing I would note though is that turning a 5-11 team or better into a winning team is very doable within 2 years. However, if a coach inherits a team that is worse than 5-11, it becomes a little more difficult to turn that around. Before we move on to what seeing a head coach 3 years into his tenure with a team tells us, I want to talk about coaches that had an overall losing record after 2 years that got 3 or more years. Of those 54 coaches that had an overall losing record after 2 years, 20 of them went on to have a winning record in their third season, 30 of them went on to have a losing record in their third season, and 4 of them went on to have a 500 record in their third season. I want to talk about those 20 coaches that had a winning record in their third season though. Of those 20 coaches that had a winning record in their third season, only 7 of them would go on to have an overall winning record, while 13 of them would still go on to have a losing record. So what's the purpose of me showing you this? The purpose is to show that for the most part, the statistics, for the lack of a better word, at a certain point begin to come back down to earth. Pretty much any coach can have a winning record, but you still need to look at the whole picture. Now, what does 3 years of seeing a head coach with a team tell us? On here are 81 examples of coaches 3 years into their tenure, excluding 3-year coaches. I should note probably that if a coach had an overall losing record after 3 years, and specifically if he had a losing record in his third season, he more often than not got fired. But of these 81 coaches, 50 of them had an overall winning record after 3 seasons. Of those 50 coaches that had a winning record after 3 years, 42 of them would go on to have a winning record during their stint, 7 of them would go on to have a losing record during their stint, and 1 of them would go on to have a 500 record during their stint. 7 of these 81 coaches had a 500 record after 3 seasons. Of those 7 coaches, 6 of them went on to have a winning record during their stint, and 1 of them went on to have a losing record during their stint. Now, only 24 of them had a losing record after 3 years. And like I said, if coaches had an overall losing record after 3 years and they had a losing record in their third season, they usually got fired. But of those 24 coaches, 23 out of 24 of them would go on to have a losing record during their stay with the team, and only 1 of them would go on to have a winning record during their stay with the team, and that was Jeff Fisher with the Houston Oilers / Tennessee Titans. So we're going to move on to other topics after I show you these next 2 graphs. After 3 years, you, way more often than not, pretty much know who a coach is and what they're going to be able to do. 2 years in was kind of a straight line, but this is as close to being a straight line as it's going to get. Again, if you go to the upper right quadrant, you'll see that the upper right quadrant has many more data points than the lower right quadrant. And then if you go to the left side of the graph, the lower quadrant takes up pretty much everything. There's only 1 data point in the upper left quadrant. So I guess in my opinion, you probably know how good or bad a coach is after 2 years, but after 3 years, you almost certainly know how good or bad a coach is going to turn out to be with your team. So here's the last inheritance graph that we're going to be going over. And since most of the coaches that even make it this far into a tenure are winning coaches, you can see that they were able to get a winning record after inheriting a bunch of below 500 teams. Almost every single data point in this graph is on the left side. And a lot of the coaches that would go on to have winning records during their tenure inherited sub 500 teams, or they inherited sub 5-11 teams, or they inherited sub 6-10 teams and stuff like that. So the first 2 questions we were trying to answer is how long does it take for us to know how good or bad a coach is going to be, and how long does it take to turn a program around? My answer, based on looking at these graphs, would be it really only takes 2 years for us to see how good or bad a coach is. There are coaches that had overall losing records after their first 2 seasons with a team that would go on to have winning records, but for the most part, if a coach has a winning record after 2 years, he's probably going to go on and have a winning record during his tenure. And if he has an overall losing record after 2 years, he's probably going to go on to have a losing record during his tenure. And then as far as how long it takes to turn a program around, it's dependent on what the coach inherits. If the coach inherits a 5-11 team or better, they should be able to come in and get it on track within 2 seasons. And if they don't get it on track within 2 seasons, then 3 seasons is definitely enough time to get a program on track. So I said all this stuff. It takes about 2 years to see how good or bad a coach is. So does that mean you fire a coach with a losing record after 2 years? Not necessarily. On this graph, I have what the prior coach's win percentage was and what the new coach's win percentage was. On the horizontal line is what a head coach's predecessor's winning percentage was. And then on the vertical line is the new coach's winning percentage. And on this graph, the data points are scattered all over the place. And those two data points on the far left, those two coaches inherited an expansion franchise. So I said that you probably know how good or bad a coach is after 2 years, but that doesn't necessarily mean I think you should fire a coach after 2 years, because I guess the one thing I want you, the viewer, to take a look at is the overwhelming amount of data points on the lower half of the graph. And what is the significance of me pointing that out? It means if you fire a losing coach, you're probably just going to hire another losing coach. And that's kind of pointless. It'll probably give you some temporary satisfaction to fire a losing coach, but that's all it is temporary satisfaction. So I guess what I'm getting at with this graph is you got to make sure the right guy is out there. And the other thing I want to talk about that I haven't noted yet are the data point colors. If the data point is purple, then that means that coach improved upon his predecessor. If the data point is yellow, then that means that coach broke even with his predecessor. And if the data point is red, then that means that coach regressed from his predecessor. I guess another couple things I want to note are firing a coach with a winning record. If you go over to the right side of the graph past the 50% mark, look at how the red dots kind of overwhelm the purple dots. So I guess one thing to note is you should probably be careful about firing a coach with a winning record. Now, I should note that not all those coaches with winning records were fired. Some of them retired. But my overall point is that you should probably be careful about moving on from a winning coach. So I guess another thing that's worth noting is that it's a lot easier to improve upon a losing coach's record than it is on a winning coach's record, as when we go over to the left side of the graph, there's definitely a lot more purple dots than there are red dots. So I guess right here, this is also answering the question of what are the odds an organization can do better. More often than not, when a new coach came in, they improved upon their predecessor. I don't know if it looks like it, but there are indeed more purple dots than there are red dots. But again, most of those purple dots are on the left side of the graph. And the further left you go, the easier it is to improve upon your predecessor. As if you can see, the further right you go, the more difficult it becomes to improve upon your predecessor. And the last thing I want to go over before we move on to coaches that got multiple tenures, I want to talk about the revolving door. In all honesty, based on everything I've gone through so far, I think the revolving door is more of a result of a franchise just not being able to get the right guy than it is a result of impatient ownership or management. But at the same time, when you see a franchise have a revolving door, is it possible that the revolving door is part of the reason why a franchise can't get the right guy? Is it possible that the revolving door is scaring good candidates away because they don't think they'll get the necessary time to do what they're trying to do? It's all certainly possible. So that's also something to take into consideration. Now, the next question we are going to be trying to answer is, how did coaches that got multiple chances to be a head coach do? Dating back to around the year 2000, I found 42 coaches that had multiple stints. Now, I should note that coaches like Marty Schottenheimer and Bill Belichick's first stint was before 2000, and it also ended before 2000. But they were coaching during the time frame that I went back and tracked as well, so this slide includes all of their tenures and coaches like that. I guess another reason for this slide is because you wonder, did certain coaches get fired too early? Or did they not get enough of a chance to put their stamp on the team? Well, that becomes a little bit tricky to say because we only have 42 coaches on here. But it's something to certainly look at. So, of these 42 coaches that got multiple chances, 21 of them had a winning record during their first tenure. Now, I should note that 2 of those 21 coaches just finished their first year during their second tenure. And those coaches are Ron Rivera with the football team and Mike McCarthy with the Cowboys. But of those 21 coaches that started their coaching career with a winning record, 8 of them would go on to have a winning record in their second tenure. 2 of them would go on to have an exactly 500 record during their second tenure, and 11 of them would would go on to have a losing record in their second tenure. Between these 21 coaches, there are 28 total second, third, and fourth chances between them. Out of those 28 total tenures, 12 of them were winning records, 13 of them were losing records, and 3 of them were average, or they were 500 records. And now, 19 of these 42 coaches had a losing record in their first tenure. Of those 19 coaches, 13 of them would go on to have a losing record in their second tenure, while only 6 of them would go on to have a winning record in their second tenure. And between these 19 coaches, there are 23 total second and third chances between them. Of those 23 total second and third chances, 8 of them were winning records and 15 of them were losing records. And then 2 out of these 42 coaches were average in their first tenure. And those 2 coaches were Hugh Jackson, who had a very losing record in his second tenure, and Wade Phillips had a winning record in 3 out of the 4 tenures that he had. And I should note with Wade Phillips that he was an interim coach in multiple places, so he technically had more than 4 tenures, but I didn't include those places that he was an interim at. So I guess what we learned from this slide is that winning is hard. Just because a coach had a winning tenure before doesn't mean he can have a winning tenure again. Starting your coaching career with a winning tenure is definitely better than starting it with a losing tenure, as 42.9% of the total second, third, and fourth chances for winning coaches were winning tenures, compared to 34.8% of the second and third chances for losing coaches being winning tenures. And for the winning coaches, if we take out Mike McCarthy and Ron Rivera, who just finished their first season in their second tenure, the percentage goes up to 46.2% for coaches that had a winning tenure in their first tenure. And I guess another thing that I think should be noted is that just because a head coach is the right coach for one team doesn't mean that he is the right coach for another team. And I think that's evidenced by the facts that less than half the coaches that had a winning record in their first tenure would go on to have a winning record in their second tenure. Like Mike Shanahan and Bill Belichick come to mind for this particular thing. Mike Shanahan was absolutely the right coach for the Broncos, as he helped John Elway finally get over the hump. But he was definitely not the right coach for the Redskins. And with Bill Belichick, he to me is unquestionably the right coach for the Patriots. But he was not the right coach for the Cleveland Browns. And also, as far as did certain coaches get fired too early, let's just take a look at those 19 coaches that had a second and third chance after having a losing tenure in their first stint. Very few of them would go on to have a winning record in their second stint. Like coaches like Pat Shurmur and Hugh Jackson come to mind in this particular instance. Hugh Jackson only got 1 year. It almost seems like it was unfair to fire a coach after 1 year. And then we saw what happened with the Browns, and it's like, it wasn't good for Hugh Jackson with the Browns. And it wasn't good for Pat Shurmur in either of his stints. So the last question that we're going to try to answer in this video is, are coaches good because they're long tenured, or are coaches long tenured because they're good? I found 41 coaches that got 6+ years with a particular team. And I mean, honestly, the word long tenured could mean something different to you, but to me, it means that coach coached a team for 6+ years. So of these 41 coaches that got 6 or more years, 34 of them had a winning record during their stint with a team. Of those 34 coaches, only 9 of them inherited a 500+ team. So they didn't inherit the best team exactly. However, I guess one thing that is worth noting is that it kind of looks like it does help to have a predecessor that was above 500, as 14 out of 34 of these coaches that had winning records did indeed have a predecessor that was above 500. Now, of these 34 coaches that had a winning record, 18 of those coaches had a winning record in their first season. 24 of those 34 coaches had a winning record in their second season, and 25 out of the 34 of these coaches that got 6 or more years had an overall winning record after 2 years. So it just goes back to what I said earlier, that you probably know how good or bad a coach is going to be after 2 years for the most part. And there are definitely outliers, but for the most part, you know what a coach is capable of after 2 seasons. And as far as, are coaches good because they're long tenured, or are coaches long tenured because they're good? Honestly, I would have to lean towards the answer is that they're long tenured because they are good NFL head coaches. At least just strictly looking at this information. So I spent a lot of time talking about all that stuff. We're over 24 minutes through the video, and I never really answered the question, when is the right time to fire a head coach? And it's kind of funny that I'm about to say it depends because I spent all that time going over all that stuff and I'm ending by saying it depends. So here's what I mean. So if the coach is sub 400 after 2 seasons, there's a case to be made that that coach probably needs to go. And if the coach is between 400 and 500, then you should probably give him a third season. And then also, if a coach has an overall losing record after 2 years and then has a winning record in his third season, he definitely deserves a fourth season to see if the turnaround is real. And then if that coach has a losing record in his fourth season, then you can probably safely cut ties. And then as far as firing coaches with winning records, you should be very careful about doing that. You probably shouldn't do it until you feel extremely confident that the right guy is out there and that you can get him. Now, I'm not saying you should never fire a coach with a winning record. I'm just saying you got to make sure the guy coming in is an improvement over the guy you're taking out. But overall, I would say that for 90% of coaches, I would give them a minimum of 3 seasons. And everything I've gone over, I didn't even answer other questions that are arguably just as important as the ones I tried to answer in this video. Like, does the revolving door affect a franchise's ability to get the right guy? Does the coach elevate the roster, or does the roster elevate the coach? And when I ask that question, some examples I think of with this are Gary Kubiak, who had a losing record after coaching with the Texans for a long time, but then all of a sudden he inherited a 12-4 Broncos team, and then all of a sudden he gets a winning record during his time with the Broncos. Another coach I think of is Norv Turner, who had a losing record in his prior stints, and then all of a sudden he inherits a 14-2 Chargers team, and then he has a winning tenure. And then another question I didn't ask at all in this video is, does the coach pass the eye test? And when I say pass the eye test, you might interpret that as sideline demeanor. I mean, that's certainly part of it. But overall, if I could boil it down to one thing, when I say does a coach pass the eye test, I mean, do the players on the field look like they understand what their job is? All those 3 questions may or may not get their own video, but we'll see what happens. So let me know what you guys think. When do you think the right time to fire a head coach is? Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.